Hello and good day, everyone. You are tuning in to the Undeniable Podcast, an ambitious foray into the exciting yet not often enough explored world of excellence in the Virgin Islands. I am Shea Alexander, the host of this series of exciting conversations, and I am the founder and principal consultant of OAC Group, a multidisciplinary consulting firm offering strategic growth and business development solutions. Undeniable has been curated for those keen to learn from individuals at the height of their career. Together, we'll enjoy frank discourse and unpack what it means and takes to be great undeniably. Undeniable leans on OAC Group's extensive network of clients, partners, and friends to feature an impressive roster of industry leaders and brilliant minds in riveting unscripted conversations monthly. So, this is part 2 of episode 4, where I am joined by Dr. Richard Georges. When we ended off part 1, he was just telling me about the BVI Lit Fest and how that idea had sort of been birthed in his mind. So let's go back to Athena jumping out.
Okay.
You get that reference?
No.
No? Good. Okay. So I just gave Dr. Georges a literary genius, or a literary reference he didn't know. So you know Athena in Greek mythology?
Yes.
The goddess of wisdom, she came out of Zeus's head.
Yeah. Okay. There you
Yeah,
go.
so it's a
Okay.
people. I mean, I think there's a more specific way they say it, but generally it refers to really good ideas coming out.
Yeah, the emergence of ideas. Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't know why my mind went to the birth of Venus, so maybe I was getting my myths mixed up. But
Okay.
because Venus emerges from the shell, but anyhow, and it's a
Yeah,
famous
from the water.
Renaissance painting.
Mm-hmm.
So the Lit Fest now, in this current iteration, it started during COVID,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a collaboration between myself and Department of Culture, Kathy Smith, Dr. Kathy Smith.
Mm-hmm.
And we started in the first instance with a series of online workshops and panel discussions.
Okay.
And so I was able to kind of rely on my Rolodex.
Mm-hmm.
No one actually uses a Rolodex, but,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of help us kind of get those events populated.
Mm-hmm.
And in the following year, that's when I was adamant that we needed to do it in person. We needed to get it off the ground. And so we were able to do some fundraising, and of course, as with most things in education and culture and that kind of thing, environmental stuff, thank God for Unite BVI saying yes to the grant proposal. And we were able to get a couple other donors on board, and we had a festival, and we were able to get a number of really exceptional writers, and to start platforming some local writers.
Okay.
And so each year we kind of try to push a bit more, push and push. So where we've kind of now discovered a sort of a schedule that kind of makes sense, formats that make sense. Like the first year we had, you're always learning, and adjusting. Going back to the previous conversation about being willing not to throw the whole thing out, but figure out
to pivot.
How to redesign and figure out this doesn't work, so we need to do this differently. And so we realized, and of course with support of like yourself and others, that we could kind of allow other creative people to kind of curate some of the panels.
Yeah, I do remember that.
And it also lends those conversations a bit of authenticity.
Indeed.
Instead of us trying to kind of micromanage everything. We also were able to find a number of venue sponsors that were able to support us. And so we, are, again, still learning. But I think in our workshops that we provide for writers, we provide like one-on-ones with literary agents and publishing professionals. That you really can't get those opportunities
elsewhere
here without the Lit Fest.
Yes.
And I think for the Friday panel discussions, not just focusing them on literature, but also what literature is really about is the experience of the people in the place. And it's not taking a broader approach and say, well, let's have some discussions about things that matter and things that are facing us. Hopefully literature can emanate from those things. Whether essays or articles or nonfiction or fiction or whatever. But at least we can be talking about these things and kind of germinating these ideas, collectively, sort of almost like a democratized type of space. To start thinking about these types of issues. So when they appear in print, that they're not sort of necessarily appearing for the first time, and we kind of recognize literature's role in reflecting ourselves back to us. So I think those are some of the things that we were kind of working on, and it's a real joy to see the festival continue to kind of evolve and take on things. But what I'm really passionate about is developing the local literature, developing writers, and also understanding of what literature is and what it's meant to do.
Yeah. So I just got a little excited because you just gave me an idea. Because so you had me do the 2021 and 2022 and 2023 Lit Fest. And one of the things that I decided this year was that I did, despite what you just said, I did want it to align a little bit more with some sort of literary work. So I'm basing it around Shea O'Neill, who
Life Notes.
Yeah, Life Notes. Like I shared with you on rereading that recently, two things that shocked me. One, I stole the book, which I did not know. I actually stole it from the school, so I'll give it back to them at some point, ages ago. But two, Shea O'Neill was, I don't even want to say the consummate entrepreneur. He was an exceptional entrepreneur. I don't know if people really understand how brilliant he was, how pioneering he was, and how transformative he was. And just as an aside, because I don't want us to go down this rabbit hole, but I was having a conversation with my parents the other day. Something, and I know people mean well, but something I do find infuriating in the BVI is this idea that leadership and making a contribution to national development has to come in the form of political participation. One could even argue about how much contribution they really make. I mean, comparatively, I'm sure they do things, but comparatively. But when you look at somebody like Shea O'Neill and you catalog, because in writing notes, I was like gobsmacked by how many things he did and how many firsts he had. When you take notes from somebody like him and you realize how much he did, there are not many politicians that can hold a candle to him, and he was not really. I mean, he had a political career for a short time, but he wasn't really a fixture in the legislature. But anyway, so I wanted to base it around that, and I just had a concept just now, but I'll tell you about it after. But one of the things that I do know, because I actually, to be very honest, I had the thought myself. And then I have had people ask it to me. And I don't think they asked it with nefarious intent. I think they were genuinely curious. What is the relevance of a lit fest in the BVI? Because I think there are some people that believe, whether falsely or correctly, that we don't really have a literary culture. What would you say to that?
Well, it's demonstrably false. Demonstrably false. And I think we'll be tiptoeing into the region of what is referred to in some academic circles as post-truth, where we sort of kind of are creating our own narratives and realities. The BVI is actually a very literary space and has been for centuries. Whether you're looking at we're talking about J.R. O'Neill, and Life Notes is a memoir. I think the challenge has been in our recording of, and in our recognition of, and our celebration of our literature. So it's not for a paucity of content. It's a paucity of vision and the import of that content. So Alpheus Norman, right, who is an Anagadian poet, Rufus Faulkner. I don't know. Anagadian poets go to kind of more than carry their weight for the population of respective literary contribution. I don't know why that is, but I would say Norman and Faulkner in particular.
It makes sense though.
Yeah, because you kind of
the smaller islands. Yeah.
But they were exceptional writers. Exceptional writers, and they wrote a lot. And actually, if you read Life Notes, J.R. O'Neill speaks about Alpheus Norman as being a writer, as being a thinker and one of his good friends, and talks about him walking about the place with a notebook full of poems. And so you think
and he has one of the poems in there. A poem about, I could be wrong and I hope I'm not wrong, but I think it's a poem about a shipwreck.
The loss of the schooner Fancy Me.
Where 50-something young men had died.
Yeah, which is possibly, I mean, as far as we know, because we've lost too much of Norman's work to really appreciate how great he was. So I think, as far as I'm aware, between what is published, I mean, in both life notes and Such Are the Hours, I Found Peace by Janet Smith, and publications with Daily News and St. Thomas, and Cyril Creaky, a Sint-Thomian poet who will be a contemporary of Norman. Outside of the works that you can find there, there's some work that his granddaughter Andrea Flax had, and she was kind enough to share with me. But actually, in my doctoral dissertation, it focused on 3 main Caribbean poets, and particularly the utility of the sea as a motif in their work. Yeah. But I have a whole chapter where I just focus on BVI writers, and similarly demonstrating that they have similar concerns. And so while they might have been removed from the Caribbean literary canon per se, it is quite clear they were preoccupied by similar themes. And so, I looked at Verna Penn Mall. There's Jenny Wheatley, there's Sheila Heinemann, there's a long list of Quincy Lettsome. There's a long list of Virgin Islander writers,
especially per capita.
So yeah, yeah. So I think it's more a question about, and that's one of the concerns of LitFest, is not that this writing is non-existent. It's a question of where we place it in the context of our I'll use the word national with a lowercase n, but our national identification, our cultural identification, and recognizing the importance of literature and our writers in framing those ideas.
Yeah. So this takes us to, and I know you're aware of the fact that I actually still haven't formed up on what I'm going to use as that connector between you as a visionary leader and the BVI Lit Fest, but I'll figure it out tonight, I'm sure. But in the meantime and between time, we have to talk about it, as abstract as it may be. If those people were correct, and I think those of us who know enough about BVI history, and I'll throw in here that a lot of condemnation of BVI culture, heritage, and history comes from ignorance, because we have not attended to these things appropriately. So there's not enough awareness of certain ideas. There's not enough awareness of the fact that BVI Landers started a lot of things here that people seem to think somebody came and gifted to us. The fact that we have done a lot of work for ourselves, and the fact that ultimately, I think to call any culture non-existent it betrays the basic idea of the word, because every person has an identity. Regardless of how interesting, quote unquote, or not interesting that identity is, regardless of how multidimensional it may appear, they have an identity. And similarly, I define culture as essentially the identity of a group, a collective. So the BVI having a culture is not something that, we don't have more or less of a culture than anybody else. We all have a culture. Some cultures, I think, based on certain tropes and stereotypes, are considered to be louder than others. So in the Caribbean, for example, most of us kind of get relegated to be in the shadow of Jamaica. But we all have culture. It just manifests in different ways, and we comport ourselves in relation to our culture in different ways. Where do we fit? And this may seem a bit radical, but it's not really intended to be. Where do we fit the idea of deliberately growing beyond where we are in the context of culture? Because at some point, right, as a person, we might, and this is not true, but we might say that Shea is a shy person. But Shea might decide, I want to be a marketing professional. And at some point, somebody says, well, Shea, the truth is, if you want to excel in marketing, you have to be articulate, you have to be confident, you have to be a little bit more extroverted. And so, if all goes well, I develop those competencies, I develop those characteristics, and I am still Shea. I have not unbecome Shea, because that's not how identity works. It grows in response to context, environment, etc. Where do we fit a sort of intentionality around developing who we are as a people with ideas like the Lit Fest? So even if it were true that we were not necessarily a literary people, which I think, like you said, we are, but even if it were true that we aren't, where do we fit deciding this is who we ought to be? And this goes back also to the idea of some of the programs you've sort of really pushed at the college in terms of professional development in tourism and financial services. The idea of grooming us for where we ought to be. How do you put those thoughts together, and then how do you work to actually get people to buy into that?
Okay, so let me
I know it's a very loaded question,
yeah,
but take it in
let me tackle it,
pieces.
because I think you mentioned a couple things that I will use as sort of tent poles to the response. I think I have to separate myself intellectually, you know, from what might be. I'll use a term with deliberately a more nationalistic approach, right? Because I have an inherent distrust to those kinds of impulses.
Okay.
Right. So one could say.
I think I need to stop you. Maybe you should explain that.
In terms of what national? Well,
because
I'll
I think it
elaborate.
has broad connotations.
I'll elaborate.
Yeah.
Right. So, what I mean by nationalistic, right? And we're going to take for granted the fact, the literal fact that
we're not
a nation.
Sure.
Put that to the side. But we might have aspirations, right, to become one. Fine. But a project in the project of nation building, you sort of have to pick a philosophy, right? You have to start thinking about, for example, what are the values, right, that we have as a nation? What identifies us as separate and distinct? What is important to us? And that's an important conversation to have. However, there's another aspect. That's the intentionality part in terms of forming what is coming out. In some respects, you could argue that that's a position of arrogance, that you actually have control of all, and this is the word I'm going to use, environmental factors. Right? Now you can control many of them, but you really don't know, and you really can't fully control what you're producing. Right? So that there's like a lowercase p political aspect to it, where you're thinking, okay, what do I want Virgin Islands culture to be? What I want Virgin Islands society to be, and then you would think I would then have certain policies in place to help shape and control what the outcome is going to be. Yeah. That is not my concern.
Okay.
Right? I do not have that political concern. I have a different political concern.
Okay.
And that political concern is making sure that we have the right environment, right, to facilitate cultural development. I do not have a personal interest, right, in dictating what is developed.
Okay.
I want to make sure that the society has the tools, that it has the opportunities, that it has the fora to examine ideas, to take stock of what is taking place, to appreciate its history, to recognize how the world is changing around it, to have the necessary conversations to come up with what it will be. So that separates my, as president of the college, and as a writer, and as someone with a particular intellectual philosophy, from what might be, let's say, a governmental position.
Just not to cut you off, but to give an analog, essentially parenting or teaching 101, right? Because in my conversation with Dr. Smith, that was one of the things I think she had ended on. As an educator, she's not concerned necessarily with telling you where you are to end up, but with ensuring that because of your exposure and your roundedness, and your confidence, where you can end up becomes a lot more broad.
Exactly.
So you don't feel as though, well, the only thing I'm good at is X, so I have to go and be X. You feel as though there are a lot of opportunities in front of you. So I think you're saying at the national level, again, we keep having to air quote there, it's the same thing. Okay.
Yeah, so okay. And I think for my part, and to tie it back to like language and literature, and you made the point about words and their importance. And, it's difficult to have certain conversations, Shea, if you lack the vocabulary. Right? So one of the reasons, and I'll posit this, one of the reasons why there's not a serious discussion and dialogue about the political future, capital P political future of the BVI, in terms of what the BVI wants to be, right, It's because we lack, as a society, we lack the vocabulary to have that conversation. So
Yeah.
one of my jobs is to sort of like help us develop that vocabulary without trying to like force a particular conversation or a particular conclusion.
Yeah.
Is to help us develop, so for example, and I know we're on a bit of a tangent, but self-determination is not a euphemism for independence.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But
yes.
we it's not. To go back to the things that words matter, and just another quick pet peeve. The term indigenous Virgin Islander. None of us are indigenous to a space, right? Our ancestors were literally kidnapped and spirited away and died in transit, and then were subjugated here. So the term indigenous Virgin Islander, talking about the importance of words, is inaccurate. Well, so whether you want to talk about ancestral, because you have an ancestral connection, but that is a form of erasure of the indigenous people of this region, and it's a sort of it in itself is a sort of linguistic violence that we're engaging in, which is mirroring, the same sort of colonial language that is used to subjugate us. So I think I'm very concerned and I would say, occupied with language and its import, and how much your vocabulary dictates the type of thinking you can even engage in.
Well, indigenous is a word that I think is very presumptive, because indigenous is a word that has a lot to do with our awareness of history and movement. So even the people that we would probably call indigenous, so like the Arawaks and the Caribs, we don't know that they were indigenous. We know that they were here before the slaves were, who were here before some of the recent immigrants. But I think you touched on a very important point about the need to be able to articulate yourself. I don't know if people understand why, for example, babies oftentimes just cry because they can't talk. So this is the only signal that I have that I need attention.
This is my language.
Right? Yeah. And so when you look at, again, kind of taking some of those very simple ideas of a person, an individual person, and then extrapolating them at the whole, I think as a people, we don't really know what we want. I would go further than to say we just don't know how to say it. I don't think we know what we want.
Which is fine.
So, yeah. But we can't figure out what we want if we don't have the words to start having conversations, whether internally or externally.
Or even the words that help us formulate what is possible.
Yeah. So I think you hear people, and I don't want to even touch on any specific thing, but just because it's the example you use, you hear people throw around the word of independence, and it's very obvious they don't actually know what that means. But it just sounds like the closest thing to what their mind is telling them is what I want. But when we had our first sort of preliminary conversation, you spoke about language a little bit. And I do want to give you the opportunity to just, why is language so important to you? And I'm not making comparisons here, but why is a lit fest so important as against, for example, a music fest? Which probably, well, I just put two words together just now. I wasn't referring to anything specific. But why is that? Why is that so important to you?
Well, music fests are important as a form of cultural celebration and expression.
Yeah,
and it's the same reason for Lit Fest. I think it's just that we see one is more familiar than the other, and we're accustomed to seeing one. So I think, for example, the BVI in general has done, in terms of modes of cultural expression, has done a much better job in appreciating
music
and celebrating music and its cultural relevance and its space in the cultural hierarchy than it has in probably any other cultural form.
Yeah.
Including dance.
Yeah.
So I think it's about us provide, or not you mentioned visual art. So it's about us trying to make space for these other modalities to sort of be similarly elevated. It just so happens that this is the space in which I have some expertise. But I would argue, for example, with visual art, we have to be very careful, for example, in treating it purely as commodity, because then it kind of holds back what Virgin Islands art can be. And for example, why do we not see as much, for example, sculpture? Do we really, are we really happy with our sculptures or national figures, national heroes being imported? Or would you prefer to have to develop a Virgin Islander sculptor
Mm-hmm.
who can then be the person interpreting these symbols and these
Mm-hmm.
figures. So just an example. So
Mm-hmm.
it's about making sure that these other cultural modes are similarly celebrated and expressed and platformed
Mm-hmm.
so that we can see ourselves as a writer, as a sculptor, as a painter, and not of it being sort of a lesser art form or a less viable endeavor.
Yeah. I want to ask you a question now, as we sort of conclude the conversation around the idea of culture. Where do we draw the line into being overambitious? So you gave the example just now of sculpting, and I'm confident there were BVI sculptors in the past. I'm confident at least one BVI learner has done nearly everything possible, probably at least one at some point. But how do we make determinations as to what we prioritize? Because obviously, as you know, as the leader of an organization, resources are limited. Scarcity is a real thing. So I remember growing up, I used to have a lot of back and forth with my dad because I genuinely felt at one point like my father wanted me to do everything. And looking back, I really understand that it was a testament to his belief in me. But at the time, it just felt like am I not going to sleep? Like everything that I wanted to do, he used to have this specific thing he would say to us, which was be producers, not consumers. So if you want to toy around with computers, why don't you try to learn to code? If you really like eating, why don't you learn to cook? That was the way he wanted us to think. But as much as I appreciate that, and as much as I appreciate even I think your passion for BVI culture and your willingness or your want to see it evolve, where do we draw boundaries and say, okay, well, that might be a little bit too out there in terms of resources in particular, but even in terms of just enough general consensus that it is important. And I'll pick on these specific examples, sculpting. I don't know of any BVI sculptors. I don't know of anybody that's interested in that. But I could see the merit of it. So where do we draw the line in terms of saying, okay, we are going to focus on the production of rums, we're going to leave lemonade and limeade alone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what my thing is not so much, like I said, is never to be prescriptive. So for my mentality is to create the foundation, create the platform, create the opportunity. So if similarly, for example, there was like I'm speaking into the future, like a BVI biennial, a celebration of art and local artists and trying to sort of elevate visual art from commodity to art for art's sake. So perhaps fewer beach scenes, for tourist consumption, and more impressions of us as a people, where we are, where we might be going, or what sorts of themes are dictating or preoccupying us.
Like Mr. Vanderpool's paintings,
exactly,
for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who is very much concerned about representations of heritage.
Yes.
And everything he's done. So like almost as if like the paintings, while being beautiful pieces in and of themselves, are just one expression of his thematic preoccupation, because he has the museum and some other things he's done.
Yeah.
So it's about creating avenues for more people like him and Cedric Tumble and others, to treat art as a viable career. So whether it is a sculpt, I just made an offhand comment about sculpting, but there should be no fear
to do anything
for a young person to say, I'm going to be an artist, I'm going to be a sculptor, I'll work with clay or metal or whatever, or I'm going to be whatever forum or whatever platform, whatever media I'm going to utilize to tell these stories, to reflect Virgin Islanders' identity back to the society.
Yeah.
And so hopefully with the Lit Fest, more people see it to do it with literature. And of course, literature is not just fiction and poetry, but also non-fiction, like
historical record, etc.
Yeah, so I think it's about cultivating the desire for us to see that. And I don't necessarily mean that has to be just books. It might be blogs and websites and other things.
Yeah, as the media
magazines
evolves.
and so on.
Yeah. I want to ask you
or film even, yeah.
I want to ask you one more question about culture, but then we'll move on to the final part of this conversation. So just give me a quick answer to this, as a parent yourself, but also as a quasi-parent to a couple hundred students or dozens of students. I don't know, I'm sure I'll go to the college. But as a parent, what role does, not specifically culture, but something like chronographs of culture, so paintings, films, sculptures, music, what role does that play in the formative development of children, and why is it important to them?
Well, it's, I mean, it's exceedingly important. I think we have no problem with this, particularly in the area of literature. The younger the kid is, right? There's a point in time. I'm speaking as a parent slash educator. There's a point in time when kids tend to start to fall out of love with literature or school or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
Right? And it's the point in time where, again, where we try to become uber prescriptive. Right? Is the kids stop liking poems when the teacher has the answers.
Yeah.
Right? When the poem is no longer
there's something specific
something that they can enjoy.
Yeah.
Right. When it's something that there's an answer key, and if it's not on this sheet, it's wrong. That's the point where we start to lose children. So kids think they don't like poetry when all of them have favorite songs.
Yes. Yes.
So it's anachronistic. And then so then you start looking at other the arts in general. When we tell them that they can't do things, right, or what they're doing isn't right, the kids is learning to express themselves. Once we're giving them, going back to the same conversation about providing a platform and giving people the tools, and then let them do what it is that they're going to do. When we try to teach poetry in particular, is the one thing where we seem to think that there's an answer key. And the deeper you study poetry, as you go up through the level of tertiary education, you realize that there isn't an answer key.
It's interpretive.
You have to have, and it's about building this. And think about this, right? If you have someone who can enjoy and interpret poetry on their own terms, they've developed the highest order of critical thinking.
Yeah.
Because they have to infer, they have to glean, they have to sort of recognize the symbols and allusions.
Yeah.
And so when you're using poetry in education, you're really trying to develop independent thinkers that can tell you, well, this means this to me because, and they can then pick up the poem and show you, line by line, image by image, word by word, why this meaning is being developed. When we try and tell them that no, that's wrong, CXC tells me this is the answer and nothing else.
Yeah.
We're killing the creativity, and we're also killing creative and independent thinking
and confidence.
Of course.
Yeah, it's like Animal Farm. When I first read Animal Farm, it was just a nice story about animals talking. I still don't know if I grasp all of the themes of it, to be honest. I read it when I was.
If you go back and read it now, it'll probably be a bit different.
Maybe not. Who knows? We're never as clever as we think, And I think sometimes the challenge with very popular art is that it becomes difficult to have your own interpretation because it's so evident what you're supposed to have interpreted from it. So with Animal Farm now, I think there have been so many interpretations. That's why I've always enjoyed reading things that were a bit outside of the norm because I don't have to be pressured by everybody else's
it's
already.
Not on the syllabus.
Yeah, this is what she meant by Frankenstein's monster. I'm not so much interested in that. But I think we spoke a bit about vision as we started this conversation, but I wanted to end off with the more practical side of the question again. How do you balance vision, so this ability to conceptualize and ideate and think beyond the current? How do you balance that with an idea of actual resource shortages, challenges, the stakeholders who may or may not be impressed with your idea? How do you make those two things work together to actually succeed?
That's when you're forced to be most creative. That's when you kind of show at your, you show your mustard, I guess. I can't remember what the phrase is, But that's where the real work is, because it's all well and good to have an aspirational vision. That's in some ways that's the easiest part. Is figuring out how to navigate the real world to realize some version of it, because it's not going to be exactly what it is, you envisioned, and to recognize that and to be okay with that. Is also an internal hurdle to climb, because if we're too slavish to the initial ideal, that you wrote down or dreamed up, not recognizing that what you have to create is actually something that's better than that, because it has to be also practical. Is where you can fall down. Is where you can fall down. And in terms of navigating the people, navigating the restrictions,
Mm-hmm.
navigating your constraints, navigating life and the world as it evolves.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you have to kind of like, make yourself worth your paycheck, because that's the job as a leader.
Yeah.
If you're taking the whole euphemism of leadership, etc., and the whole metaphor of leadership as you and people behind you,
Mm-hmm.
you can talk about servant leadership and the like, but you're navigating a path that no one really knows
Mm-hmm.
where it's going and what's going to pop up on the path.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to make decisions on the fly, to the best of your ability,
Mm-hmm.
to get past those areas that are of concern and difficulty,
Mm-hmm.
to get kind of a bit closer, another iteration towards what will be success. And you also have to be, not to get all biblical, you have to be also cognizant of the fact that maybe you might not be the one to see the promised land.
Yeah.
But you would have done your part to kind of get us a little bit closer on the path. I think, for example, for this institution should be, in my estimation, if the vision of H. Lavistot is realized,
Mm-hmm.
a sort of beacon for the territory,
Mm-hmm.
a sort of a place, for innovation,
Mm-hmm.
for means testing,
Mm-hmm.
for policy guidance for a futuristic and visionary and
Mm-hmm.
forward-thinking government,
Mm-hmm.
to sort of guide policy with respect to economy, with respect to immigration, with respect to economic development, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But it also ought to be a place where meaningful international research is being, embarked upon,
Mm-hmm.
and treating the BVI as sort of like a testing ground, not just for local issues, but for international things. We ought to be a place, if fully realized, a research institution,
Mm-hmm.
issuing not just associate degrees, but bachelor's, masters, and doctorates. Not necessarily you don't necessarily need to do everything for everybody.
No.
But increasingly more specialized in areas. You're thinking of things in terms of sustainable development. You're thinking of things like environmental sciences, disaster management, financial services and finance,
Mm-hmm.
and those types of areas. Education.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the types of areas where the college ought to become a regional leader.
Mm-hmm.
Because we sort of have the demographics within the territory to sort of prove a lot of concepts and ideas for larger jurisdictions throughout the region.
Indeed. And I am going to conclude here with the question that I'm supposed to ask every episode, but I tend to forget. What is undeniable about you?
What's undeniable about me? I would say my commitment to the power of words, of language, and my commitment, I think, in doing what I can to give back to the people and institutions that help form me.
Okay. Thank you. So this has been the conclusion of episode 4 with Dr. Georges that I have still not actually named. We have one more guest coming up who I think you guys should be very, very excited about. I think she continues a trend of real excellence and brilliance. However, she's my first guest who does not have a doctorate. So I guess that's a bit of a change from the norm, but she's equally as bright. Dr. Georges, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a really, really interesting conversation, and I do feel like I learned a lot more about the way that you think and the importance you place on culture, and the many ways in which culture interacts in informative ways. And by informative, I don't mean informational, but in terms of as an influencing factor with various aspects of who we are as a people, as a nation, and as we think about progress. So thank you very much for joining me. I appreciated this. And to my listeners, I look forward to seeing you guys in the next month when I come up with my final guest before we conclude this season of Undeniable. Thank you very much.